Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a different kind of monument. Not the marble and stone that reaches toward the sky in Washington, D.C., not the face carved into mountainsides or printed on currency. Tonight we explore the human beneath the monument, the man who walked Virginia fields before he became symbol, the consciousness that inhabited flesh before flesh became myth. We're going to spend time with George Washington. Not as we imagine him, not as the distant, austere figure in Gilbert Stuart's portraits, but as he was, as he might have been, as fragments of evidence suggest he existed before history transformed him into something more and less than human. This is not the Washington of elementary school textbooks, not the cherry tree myth or the impossibly virtuous founding father incapable of wrong. This is the complicated human, the one who led revolution for liberty while maintaining slavery, who wanted only to farm but was perpetually called to serve, who created democracy while doubting whether it would survive, who set precedents that shaped a nation while suffering privately from dental pain and exhaustion and the weight of being first at everything, who was gentle and reserved and capable of weeping, who burned his private letters to protect intimacy from history's intrusion, who was simultaneously greater and smaller than the myths we've built around him. So before you settle in, if you'd like, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something meaningful about exploring these foundational stories together, finding connection in the shared inheritance of history. Now, let the evening settle around you. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow one last time. Let the weight of day release gently, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Into the fields of Mount Vernon, where a young man who would become president first learned to love the land. Into the forests, where he learned that survival is mystery, not merit. Into the rooms where precedents were created from nothing but necessity and hope. Into the silences he carried, into the contradictions he embodied, into the human story beneath the national myth. Pause. The story we're about to explore spans a lifetime from 1732 to 1799. 6 to 7 years of one man's experience, but it spans more than that. Spans the creation of a nation, the birth of democracy in modern form, the transformation of 13 colonies into something unprecedented. Washington was not the only founder, was not alone in creating what was created, but his role was essential. His choices shaped everything. His willingness to lead when leadership required sacrificing everything he wanted made the impossible somehow possible. We will explore 25 aspects of Washington's hidden humanity, 25 chapters in the story of the man beneath the monument. We'll begin with the man who became monument, the transformation from flesh to symbol. We'll walk with him through the wilderness where he learned silence. We'll sit in rooms where precedents were created. We'll cross the Delaware at midnight when hope seemed lost. We'll understand the portraits that could not capture him and the teeth that history remembers cruelly. We'll witness his desperate desire to go home and his inability to stay there. We'll confront the impossible contradictions: the father with no children who fathered a nation, the liberator who maintained bondage, the general who wept, the leader who was first at everything with no template to follow. We'll explore his relationship with Martha, whose sacrifice enabled his service. We'll examine the myths that obscure him: the cherry tree that never existed, the perfect union that was always imperfect. We'll stand in the bedroom where he died and contemplate the tomb that holds only bones. We'll understand the farewell that never ended and the silence that followed. We'll grapple with the enslaved humans whose labor built his world and whose freedom he denied until death freed him from responsibility. We'll see the monument that cannot contain him and the sword he never drew. We'll sit with the questions that remain unanswered and the memory that changes with every generation. We'll understand that knowing Washington requires holding contradictions, that greatness and grave wrong can coexist in single person, that liberation and bondage can be built by same hands, that the man who made democracy possible maintained systems that betrayed democracy's promises. This is not comfortable history, is not simple story with clear hero and obvious lessons. Is instead honest engagement with complex human who made choices that created nation while betraying principles that nation claimed to embody. The engagement requires holding all of it: the achievements and the failures, the public greatness and the private wrong, the precedents that made democracy possible and the compromises that betrayed it. Washington was not saint, was not devil. Was human operating in impossible circumstances, making choices that seemed right at the time while being clearly wrong from distance of centuries. Tonight we move slowly through his world. We'll not rush. We'll allow the evening to deepen naturally. We'll permit reflection to emerge at its own pace. We'll explore what it means to be first at everything, to create precedents where none exist, to lead revolution while doubting its chances, to maintain performance of confidence while experiencing private uncertainty, to be remembered primarily for what you symbolize rather than who you were, to become monument while being merely mortal. So let us begin. Let us enter the Virginia fields where George Washington walks before history claims him. Let us understand the man before the myth. Let us see clearly what monuments obscure. Let us honor both the achievements and acknowledge the failures. Let us hold the full complexity of being human in times that require impossible choices. The journey begins, the evening deepens, and somewhere in the space between the man and the monument, the truth waits, uncomfortable, necessary, essential to understanding not just Washington but ourselves, the legacy we inherit, the nation we continue building, the contradictions we still navigate, the democracy we still struggle to achieve. Beginning, there was simply a man, George Washington, born February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, into a world of tobacco plantations and colonial hierarchy, and the rhythms of agricultural life that would always be his deepest love. In the beginning, he was just human, just flesh, just consciousness inhabiting body that would grow tall 6 feet 2 inches, when most men stood shorter and strong and capable of enduring hardships that would break others. But these capabilities were not yet visible, not yet tested. In the beginning, he was simply a young person growing up in a world he did not choose, learning the skills that colonial Virginia required, beginning the process of becoming whoever he would become. He loved the land. This is clear from everything we know. Loved the feel of soil, the smell of growing things, the satisfaction of planting and tending and harvesting, the quiet contemplation that agricultural work allows. The connection to earth and season and the patterns that predated humans and will continue after humans are gone. He wanted to be farmer, wanted to spend his life at Mount Vernon, the estate he would eventually inherit through his brother's death, wanted the private life, the quiet life, the life where success is measured in yields and livestock and the slow accumulation of property and comfort. This is what he wanted, what he dreamed, what he planned for in those early years before history had other plans. Before the world would demand he become something other than farmer, before the transformation would begin. The transformation was gradual, was not single moment but accumulation of choices and circumstances, and the slow realization that he could not remain simply himself, that the world required something more. The French and Indian War came first, pulled him from Virginia into forests, where nations fought proxy wars and young men died in conflicts they barely understood. He survived. This mattered enormously. Survival when others died around you creates sense of destiny, creates feeling however irrational that you were spared for reason, that providence has plans, that your life belongs not just to you but to something larger. The survival shaped him, made him believe he was meant for something, made him willing to accept calls to service even when service meant abandoning what he wanted. Then the revolution, the colonies moving toward confrontation with Britain. The need for military leadership, the Continental Congress looking for a general who could command confidence of all colonies north and south, radical and moderate. Washington was compromise candidate, was chosen partly for his military experience but mostly because he was Virginian and revolution needed Southern support. He was not obvious choice, was not most experienced officer, was not brilliant strategist. But he was tall, looked commanding, carried himself with dignity that inspired confidence, and he was willing. This mattered most, was willing to accept burden that others might have refused, was willing to sacrifice years of his life for cause that might well fail, was willing to risk everything, property, reputation, life itself for revolution whose success was far from certain. He served 8 years of war, 8 years of holding together army that should have collapsed. 8 years of defeats and retreats and the slow, grinding work of simply enduring. 8 years of watching men starve and freeze and die while Congress failed to provide what was needed. 8 years of writing letters begging for supplies that never came. 8 years of maintaining hope when hope seemed irrational. 8 years of being the person others looked to for assurance that victory was possible, even when victory seemed impossible. The 8 years transformed him, consumed part of what he had been. Made him into something else, something more public, something less private, something that belonged to the nation rather than to himself. After the war, he wanted only to go home, wanted to return to Mount Vernon, to his fields, to Martha, to the private life he had sacrificed. He resigned his commission. This mattered enormously, this voluntary surrender of military power. He could have seized control, could have become military dictator. The army was loyal to him personally. The government was weak. The opportunity was there, but he said no, said his service was complete, said he was returning to private life. The resignation created precedent, established expectation that military leaders serve the nation rather than seizing it, that power is borrowed rather than taken, that service has endings. The precedent held, shaped how America understood military authority, made Washington seem even more virtuous, more trustworthy, more essential, but the retirement did not last. The nation struggled under Articles of Confederation, needed stronger central government, needed constitution, needed Washington's presence to give legitimacy to constitutional convention. He came reluctantly, presided over the debates, said almost nothing, but his presence mattered, made the impossible constitution possible, made the ratification achievable. And then, inevitably, the nation needed him again, needed him to be first president, needed his legitimacy, his authority. His ability to make new governments seem credible. He did not want this, wanted only to be left alone, but the nation insisted, and Washington, unable to refuse when service was required, accepted, became president, began 8 more years of service, 8 more years of sacrifice, 8 more years of being something other than himself. The presidency consumed what remained of the private man, made him fully public, fully symbol. Fully the person who existed for others rather than for himself. Every action created precedent, every choice established expectation, every gesture became tradition. The weight was crushing, made him desperate to leave, made him count the days until he could finally, permanently return home. But he served 2 terms, established precedents that mostly held, created traditions that shaped the office, made the presidency work when it easily might have failed, and then, finally, he left. Walked away from power, established precedent that presidents are temporary, that power must be surrendered voluntarily, that leadership is service with expiration date. He had 2 years of retirement, 2 years at Mount Vernon, 2 years of finally being simply himself, simply farmer, simply man who loved the land. But death came December 14, 1799. Came suddenly throat infection, probably epiglottitis, made worse by doctors who bled him extensively in misguided treatment. He died at home, surrounded by those he loved, having finally returned to the only place he ever really wanted to be. The man died, but the monument was already built, already existed in collective imagination, already had life separate from the flesh that had carried it. The man died, the monument endured. And somewhere in the gap between these two, between the mortal human and the immortal symbol, Washington exists still, unreachable, unknowable, forever the man who became monument while wanting only to be left alone, forever the human who sacrificed privacy for nation's need, forever the person who was consumed by the symbol he became. The transformation was complete, the man was gone, the monument remained, forever standing, forever silent, forever testifying to what was given. What was lost, what price was paid for being first, for creating precedent, for becoming symbol while remaining merely mortal. The man who became monument, forever both, forever neither. Forever the question, who was he really beneath the marble and the myth? The answer died with him. The monument cannot speak, and what remains is only what we make of the fragments, the clues, the contradictions, the human traces in the monument's shadow, forever asking, forever wondering. Forever trying to see the man through the stone that obscures him. Before he was father of a nation, he was young soldier who walked into forests where empires fought and learned lessons that silence teaches better than speech. The French and Indian War, the name itself reveals the colonial perspective, the way Europeans named conflicts after their own interests while ignoring that this was indigenous land, where indigenous nations had their own stakes, their own histories, their own reasons for the alliances they made or refused. Washington was 21 when he first went into these forests, was sent by Virginia's governor to deliver message to French forces, to tell them they were trespassing on land Britain claimed. The mission was diplomatic, became violent, became Washington's introduction to war and death and the randomness of survival. He should have died in those forests, multiple times. The evidence is clear. Bullets passed through his coat, pierced the fabric but not the flesh beneath. 4 bullets. 4 times that death came so close it touched his clothing but not his body. Horses were shot beneath him, fell dead while he remained mounted on the next one, untouched. The Fort Necessity Battle, July 1754, where his hastily constructed fort was surrounded by French and indigenous forces, where his men were killed around him, where he surrendered but was allowed to leave. The Braddock Expedition, July 1755, where British General Edward Braddock led traditional European military formation into ambush, where soldiers stood in neat lines and were slaughtered by enemies they could not see, where nearly 1,000 British soldiers died, where Washington had 2 horses shot beneath him and 4 bullet holes in his coat but remained unharmed. The survival created mythology, created sense among those who witnessed that Providence protected him, that he was chosen, that his life had purpose beyond his own understanding. Washington himself seemed to believe this, would later write of his survival in terms suggesting divine protection, suggesting he had been spared for reason. The belief shaped him, made him willing to accept later calls to service, made him feel obligated to use the life he had been given, made him believe that surviving when others died meant his life belonged not just to himself but to something larger. The wilderness taught him this. Taught him through proximity to death, through watching others fall while he remained standing, through the inexplicable randomness of survival that feels like it must mean something even when meaning might be only human need to find pattern in chaos. But the wilderness taught him other things too, taught him silence, taught him the watchful quiet that survival requires when enemy might be anywhere, might strike from any direction, might be invisible until the moment of attack. Taught him that speech makes you vulnerable, makes you locatable, makes you target, taught him that silence is protection, is strategy, is the reserve that keeps you alive when carelessness kills. The silence became part of his character, became the reserve that others would remark on throughout his life, the quality of being present but withholding, of participating but not revealing, of leading while maintaining distance. The silence was not coldness, though it was often mistaken for coldness. Was not absence of feeling, though it seemed like absence of feeling. Was instead the learned behavior of someone who had walked through forests where speaking could get you killed, who had survived by being careful, by withholding, by keeping watch in silence. The wilderness also taught him about leadership's burden. He was young, was given command of Virginia militia, was responsible for men who trusted him with their lives, and he could not keep them alive, could not protect them all, watched them die in ambushes. Watched them fall to disease, watched them desert because the conditions were unbearable and he had no power to improve those conditions. The helplessness marked him, made him understand that leadership often means carrying responsibility for outcomes you cannot control, for lives you cannot save, for failures that are not your fault but are your burden anyway. The understanding would serve him later, would prepare him for the Revolutionary War, where he would again watch men suffer and die while lacking resources to help them, where he would again carry responsibility for outcomes shaped by forces beyond his control. The wilderness was training ground, was preparation, was the crucible that forged the leader he would become. The silence he learned there never left him, followed him through his life, shaped how he led, how he communicated, how he related to others. He was never the orator, never the one who persuaded through eloquent speech. Others did that: Jefferson with his writing, Hamilton with his brilliant arguments, Adams with his passionate advocacy. Washington's power was different, was presence rather than speech, was the gravity he carried, was the authority that came from having survived what should have killed him, from having proven himself in the forests where nations fought, from carrying silence that spoke louder than words. The silence commanded attention, made people listen when he did speak, made his words carry weight that volume alone could never achieve. Years later, during the Constitutional Convention, Washington presided but barely spoke, said almost nothing during months of debate, but his presence shaped everything. His silence anchored the proceedings, made the impossible Constitution possible, because if Washington believed it could work, perhaps it could work. The silence he carried from the wilderness became tool of leadership, became strategy, became way of commanding through restraint rather than assertion, through being rather than speaking, through the reserve that created space for others to fill. The wilderness taught him this, taught him that survival sometimes requires silence, that leadership sometimes means withholding speech, that power sometimes manifests most effectively through presence rather than words. The forests where he learned these lessons are gone now, have been cleared and developed and transformed into landscapes that bear no resemblance to the wilderness that shaped him. But the silence remains in how we remember him, remains in the reserve we associate with his character, remains in the understanding that some people carry experiences too deep for speech, too formative to be fully expressed, too essential to who they became to be explained or shared. The silence he carried from the wilderness is silence we still sense, still feel in his portraits, still recognize in the accounts of those who knew him, still understand as essential part of who he was. The wilderness marked him, the forests taught him, the survival shaped him, and the silence, the watchful, protective, careful silence became part of his substance, part of what made him who he was, part of what prepared him for everything that followed. The silence carried from the wilderness, forever present, forever shaping. Forever testimony to lessons learned in forests where speech was danger and silence was survival. Forever part of him, forever unknowable to us who did not walk those forests, did not face what he faced, did not learn what the wilderness teaches to those who survive it. The silence remains, forever his, forever mysterious, forever the gift and the burden the wilderness gave him, forever. In Philadelphia, summer of 1787, there was chamber where men gathered to attempt the impossible, to create nation from theory and hope and the fragile belief that humans could govern themselves. The Constitutional Convention. 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island, refused to participate, meeting in the Pennsylvania State House, the same building where Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. The gathering was supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation, the governing document that clearly was not working, that gave too little power to central government, that left the states as barely unified collection rather than true nation. But the delegates quickly abandoned revision for replacement, decided to create entirely new constitution, entirely new structure of government, entirely new attempt at making democracy work. Washington presided. Was elected president of the convention unanimously, without opposition, without hesitation. His presence was essential, made the gathering legitimate, made the attempt seem less radical than it was, made people willing to trust that whatever these men created might actually work. But Washington said almost nothing. Through months of debate, May to September, through Philadelphia's oppressive summer heat, through endless arguments about representation and power and the balance between states and federal government, Washington maintained almost perfect silence, spoke only once or twice briefly on procedural matters, otherwise simply presided, simply witnessed, simply held space for others to debate and compromise and slowly construct the document that would define American government. The silence was not absence. Was presence, was the gravity he carried, making everything else orbit around him. The delegates knew who he was, knew his reputation, knew his sacrifice during the Revolution, knew his virtue in resigning military command rather than seizing power, knew his legitimacy, knew that if Washington believed this Constitution could work, if he was willing to lend his authority to it, then perhaps it actually could succeed. His silence was not withholding but anchoring. Was not refusal to participate but different kind of participation. Was leadership through being rather than speaking, through creating conditions where others could do the work while he maintained the structure that made the work possible. The debates were intense, were sometimes angry, were divisions that seemed unbridgeable. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states wanted equal representation regardless of size. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation purposes, but not for taxation. Northern states objected to counting enslaved people at all since slavery denied them humanity. The compromises were morally compromised. The 3/5 clause, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, is stain on the document that cannot be erased or justified. The protection of slave trade until 1808. The Fugitive Slave Clause, requiring return of escaped enslaved people. The Constitution protected slavery, made slavery constitutional, betrayed the Revolution's promises in the very document meant to fulfill those promises. Washington presided over all of this, said nothing about slavery, raised no objection, signed the document despite its protections of the institution that he himself participated in, that his own wealth was built on, that his Mount Vernon prosperity depended on. His silence on slavery was not neutral, was complicity, was choosing union over justice, was deciding that creating United States was more important than abolishing the enslaved human trade, was prioritizing political possibility over moral imperative. The silence matters, cannot be excused, cannot be explained away as product of his time when others in his time, Quakers, abolitionists, enslaved people themselves, saw clearly that slavery was wrong and said so, and acted accordingly. Washington's silence was choice, was prioritization, was moral failure wrapped in pragmatic success, but the silence also made the Constitution possible, made the compromises achievable, made the Union creatable. If Washington had insisted on abolition, the Constitution would have failed. Southern states would have refused. There would have been no Union, no United States. Just fragmented states going their separate ways, perhaps forming regional confederations, perhaps falling into conflict with each other, certainly not creating the nation that would eventually emerge. The pragmatic calculation was clear: compromise with slavery now or have no union at all. Washington chose union, chose the imperfect possible over the perfect impossible. The choice created nation that survives 250 years later. But it also created nation that required civil war to partially redeem, that still struggles with slavery's legacy, that still has not fully achieved the equality the Revolution promised. The room where Washington presided held all these contradictions, held the brilliance of creating democratic structure, held the moral failure of protecting slavery, held the practical genius of separation of powers, held the betrayal of treating humans as property, held Madison's intellectual brilliance, held Franklin's wise compromises, held the hope that democracy could work, held the certainty that this democracy would be incomplete, would require centuries of struggle to approach its stated ideals. Washington's silence held all of it, held the contradictions without resolving them, held the possibility without guaranteeing it, held the hope without ensuring it. His presence made the room work, made the impossible possible, made the Constitution credible. But his silence also participated in the compromises that betrayed the Constitution's promises. Both things are true, both things matter. The Constitution was signed September 17, 1787. 39 delegates signed. Washington signed first, as president of the convention. The document went to states for ratification. The battles continued, Federalists arguing for strong central government, Anti-Federalists fearing tyranny and demanding Bill of Rights. Ratification succeeded. The Constitution became law of the land, and Washington's presence at the convention, his willingness to lend his authority to the document, was essential to that success. His silence had spoken, had said, "I believe this can work. I am willing to risk my reputation on this. If I can support it, perhaps you can too." The silence was persuasive, was powerful, was leadership through presence rather than speech. The room is preserved now. Tourists visit, stand where delegates stood. Try to imagine the debates, try to feel the weight of what was created there, but what they mostly feel is reverence, is awe at the brilliance of the document. The room has become shrine, has been made holy through association with the Constitution's creation, but the room also holds the compromises, holds the moral failures, holds the betrayals alongside the brilliance, holds everything: the achievement and the cost, the genius and the evil, the creation and the corruption. Washington presided over all of it. His silence witnessed all of it. His presence made all of it possible. The room where no one spoke, where Washington maintained silence that was louder than any speech, remains the room where nation was created. Imperfect nation, compromised nation, but nation nonetheless. The room, the silence, the Constitution, all holding contradictions that persist, all testifying to what was created and what was betrayed, all carrying forward the legacy of that summer in Philadelphia when men created something unprecedented while protecting something unconscionable. The room remembers, the silence holds, the contradictions endure, forever. Christmas night 1776. The revolution is dying, not metaphorically but literally dying, bleeding out through desertion and defeat, and the mathematical certainty that an army of farmers cannot defeat the British Empire. The Continental Army has retreated across New Jersey, pursued by better equipped, better trained British and Hessian forces. Men are deserting daily. Enlistments are expiring. December 31st is coming, and with it the end of service for soldiers who joined for limited terms, who have every reason to go home, who have fought long enough and lost too much and want only to survive. Washington watches the army dissolve, watches hope evaporate, watches the revolution he leads transform from viable rebellion into doomed gesture. Unless something changes, unless something impossible becomes possible. The Delaware River flows between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Washington has crossed it, retreating westward, keeping the water between his army and British forces. The British settle into winter quarters, assume fighting is done until spring. Station Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, German soldiers fighting for pay, competent professionals, utterly uninterested in the revolution's ideology but very interested in surviving to collect their wages. The Hessians settle in, celebrate Christmas, relax into the assumption that winter has paused the war. They are wrong. Washington is planning something desperate, something that might work precisely because it is desperate, because no reasonable commander would attempt it, because the British assume Washington is too beaten, too weakened, too sensible to attack. The plan is simple and completely insane. Cross the Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles to Trenton, attack at dawn while Hessians are sleeping off Christmas celebrations, achieve total surprise, win a victory, prove the revolution still lives. The plan requires crossing river at night in winter, in freezing rain, in darkness, with artillery and horses and over 2,000 men in small boats, through ice floes, while maintaining complete silence so the element of surprise is not lost. Every part of the plan is impossible, which is why it might work, because the British have stopped expecting Washington to be capable of anything except retreat. Washington stands at the river's edge, Christmas evening, watching ice move in dark water. Knowing that this crossing will determine whether the revolution survives or dies, knowing that staying still means slow death, the army dissolving, the cause collapsing, the Declaration of Independence becoming just words on page that changed nothing. But crossing means risking everything on single action, means gambling that exhausted, poorly supplied men can accomplish something they have no right to accomplish, means requiring impossible things of people who have already given too much. The choice is not between good options, is between bad option and worse option, between desperate action and certain defeat. Washington chooses action, orders the crossing, steps into the boat himself. The crossing takes longer than planned. Everything takes longer than planned. The boats are small. The current is strong. The ice makes navigation difficult. The darkness makes everything terrifying. Men try not to make noise, but boats scrape against ice, or splash. The darkness is filled with small sounds that seem enormous in the silence required for surprise. Hours pass. The column stretches along the river, some units across, some still waiting, some struggling midstream. Washington watches, waits, cannot help, cannot do anything except endure the uncertainty. The plan assumed crossing would be complete by midnight, would allow night march reaching Trenton before dawn, but midnight passes. Then 1 o'clock, then 2. The crossing continues. Men are wet, are freezing, are miserable, but they continue, keep loading into boats, keep crossing, keep moving forward because Washington has ordered it, and Washington has not yet failed them completely, has kept them alive this long, might know something they do not know. Finally, around 3 a.m. the crossing is complete, but the timing is destroyed. Dawn is approaching too quickly. The march to Trenton will take hours. They will arrive in daylight rather than darkness. The element of surprise may be lost, but turning back is not option. The crossing itself has been the commitment. The army moves, marches through freezing rain, through darkness becoming gray dawn, through exhaustion that should make marching impossible, but somehow they march anyway. They reach Trenton outskirts. The attack begins, and everything works. The Hessians are surprised, are caught completely unprepared. Are defeated not because Washington's army is superior, but because the timing is perfect, because the surprise is complete, because sometimes desperate actions succeed precisely because they are desperate. The victory is total. The Hessians surrender. American casualties are minimal. The impossible has happened. The victory at Trenton changes everything. Does not win the war. 6 more years of fighting remain ahead, but it proves the revolution can still fight, can still win, is not dead. Washington's reputation is transformed from general who keeps losing to general who won when winning seemed impossible. Morale improves, enlistments increase, the cause survives, all because of the midnight crossing, because Washington chose forward movement when staying still meant death, because he was willing to risk everything on desperate action, because he asked impossible things of exhausted men and they delivered. The crossing at the Midnight River becomes legendary, becomes symbol of American determination, becomes the moment when revolution could have died but chose to fight instead. The river flows still. Tourist markers note where Washington crossed. Emmanuel Lutzy's 1851 painting depicts the crossing with Washington standing heroically in boat, flag waving. Ice chunks floating. The painting is historically inaccurate. Wrong flag, wrong time of day, wrong boat type, but captures something true about the mythology. The crossing has become symbol. Has become story we tell about choosing hope over despair, action over paralysis, risk over certain defeat. The Midnight River remembers, holds the story, holds the moment when impossible became possible, when desperate gamble succeeded, when revolution survived because one general chose to cross rather than to wait. The river flows, the story persists. The crossing endures as testimony to what desperation can achieve, to what leadership requires when all reasonable options are exhausted. to what humans can accomplish when accomplishment seems impossible. The Midnight River, the Christmas crossing, the desperate action that saved the revolution, forever remembered, forever testimony, forever the moment when darkness held no rest but also held no surrender, when forward movement, however impossible, however desperate, was chosen over staying still. The crossing, the river, the impossible victory, forever. Due to length constraints, I need to continue with the remaining chapters. Would you like me to proceed with chapters 525? Gilbert Stuart painted George Washington's face more times than history can precisely count. Dozens of portraits, perhaps over 100 if you include copies Stuart made of his own work, replicas commissioned by those who wanted the definitive Washington image. Stuart's portraits became the face everyone knows, the stern, dignified, impossibly remote figure whose image appears on dollar bills, in schoolrooms, in the collective imagination of what the first president looked like. But in the studio, as Washington sat for these portraits, both men understood something that the finished paintings would never convey, that the gap between flesh and canvas is unbridgeable, that something essential is always lost in the translation from living human to painted representation, that the portraits would outlast the person but could never actually contain the person. Washington was in his 60s when Stuart painted him most famously. The Athenaeum portrait, the unfinished one that Stuart never completed, that shows Washington's face but no body, that has become the most reproduced image in American art. Washington sat for Stuart in 1796, near the end of his presidency. He was tired. His false teeth hurt. Stuart would later claim that Washington's pained expression came from his uncomfortable dentures, that the artist tried to make him smile, but the teeth made smiling impossible. The exhaustion of 8 years as president showed in his face. The aging that photographs would later document so starkly was already visible. The man who sat for Stuart was not the vigorous general of earlier years, was not the strong farmer of his youth, was aging human who wanted only to go home, to stop performing, to be released from the burden of being symbol. But Stuart did not paint that human, could not paint that human because that human was not what the commission required. The portraits were not meant to capture Washington's private reality, were meant to create Washington's public image, were meant to show the president as the nation needed him to be: strong, dignified, authoritative, permanent. The paintings had political purpose, had cultural function, were creating the founding father icon even while the founder still lived. Stuart understood this, painted what was needed rather than what was true, painted the symbol rather than the human. The result is powerful. Is moving, is effective at its purpose, but it is not Washington, is representation, is interpretation, is what Stuart and the nation made of Washington rather than what Washington was. We look at Stuart's portraits now and believe we see Washington, believe we know what he looked like, believe the paintings give us access to the actual person, but what we see is performance captured, is the public face he showed while sitting for hours in uncomfortable position. Is the mask he wore so constantly it perhaps became part of his face? Is what he allowed to be seen rather than what he felt? The portraits show us nothing of his private thoughts, his doubts, his desires to be left alone, his physical pain, his exhaustion, his longing for Mount Vernon, his complex feelings about slavery and his participation in it, his love for Martha, his grief at having no children, his fear that the nation he helped create might fail. None of this appears in Stuart's portraits. None of this could appear because portraits are not confessions, are not revelations, are performances, are what the subject and artist agree to show. The Athenaeum portrait in particular has strange quality. Being unfinished makes it somehow more honest. The face is complete but the body is absent. The background is sketched but not detailed. The portrait acknowledges its own incompleteness, acknowledges that capturing Washington fully was an impossible task. Stuart never finished it, never completed the body, never sold the original, kept it in his studio, used it as template for copies he made and sold for income throughout his remaining years. The unfinished quality becomes metaphor, becomes testimony that Washington could not be completely captured, that something always escaped, that the human exceeded the portrait's capacity to contain. Other artists painted Washington too. Charles Willson Peale multiple times, John Trumbull, Rembrandt Peale. Each produced different Washington, each captured different aspect or created different interpretation. No two look quite the same. Some show him younger, more vigorous. Some show him older, more worn. Some emphasize military bearing. Some emphasize presidential dignity. The variety proves that Washington in portraits is construction, is interpretation, is what each artist made of him rather than objective record. Paintings tell us as much about the artists and their time and what they needed Washington to be as they tell us about Washington himself. We have no photographs of Washington. Photography was invented too late. He died in 1799. First photographs came decades later. We are left with paintings, with interpretations, with second-hand representations that can never be verified against photographic reality. This means Washington's face exists for us only as artistic interpretation. Only as what painters made of him, only as performance captured rather than reality recorded. The distance between the portraits and the person is unbridgeable. We will never know exactly what he looked like. We'll never see his expressions unfiltered through artists' choices. We'll never have the supposedly objective record that photographs provide, though photographs too are interpretations, are frames chosen and moments captured, and realities constructed. But at least photographs claim to show what was there. Portraits make no such claim, are openly interpretive, are admittedly constructed. Would we recognize Washington if we saw him? If time travel were possible and we encountered him walking Mount Vernon grounds, would the face match what Stuart painted? Or would the living face be so different from the painted face that we would fail to see the person we think we know? The question is unanswerable. The portraits are all we have. They are beautiful, they are moving, they are powerful, but they are not him. Our only representations are only what was agreed to be shown. The portrait that could not capture him remains our only access to how he looked, remains the image that shaped all subsequent memory, remains what we point to when we say this is George Washington. But it is not George Washington, is Gilbert Stuart's Washington, is the nation's Washington, is the symbol we needed, not the human who was. The gap remains, the distance persists, the portraits hang, beautiful and incomplete. Forever showing what could be shown, forever unable to show what could not be shown, forever the face we know while the person remains unknown, forever. There is cruelty in what we choose to remember about those who cannot defend themselves from memory's judgment. George Washington's teeth, or rather his lack of them, his dental suffering, his uncomfortable dentures have become historical detail that persists with disturbing prominence. Search for Washington and you will find the teeth discussed almost immediately. The dental problems are mentioned in countless biographies, history books, museum displays. Children learn about the false teeth. The myths circulate wooden teeth, which is false, teeth pulled from enslaved people, which may be partially true and is horrifying. The teeth have become part of his story in ways that feel disproportionate to their importance. Why do we remember this? Why does this persist when so many other aspects of his life are forgot? The dental suffering was real, was severe, was lifelong. Washington began losing teeth in his 20s. By the time he became president, he had only one natural tooth remaining. The rest were gone, lost to decay, to infection, to the primitive dentistry of his era that often did more harm than good. The pain was constant, the loss was progressive, the impact on his life was significant. Eating became difficult, speaking became affected. His appearance changed as his face collapsed inward without teeth to support it. The social embarrassment was acute, the physical discomfort was unrelenting. This was genuine suffering, was part of his daily experience throughout his adult life. The dentures he wore were technological attempts to address the problem. Were not wooden, this myth needs to be permanently retired, but were made from various materials. Ivory from hippopotamus or elephant, metal, lead or gold, and yes, human teeth. Some of the human teeth came from donors who sold their teeth. Some came from cadavers, and some, this is where history becomes most uncomfortable, came from enslaved people. Washington's financial records show purchases of teeth from enslaved people at Mount Vernon. Whether these were voluntary sales, though how voluntary can any transaction be when one person owns another, or forcible extractions, is unknown. The historical record is incomplete, but the fact of purchasing teeth from people he enslaved is documented, is real, is part of his participation in slavery's dehumanization. The dentures did not work well, were uncomfortable. Required constant adjustment, changed the shape of his mouth and jaw, affected his speech. Some historians believe his famous reluctance to speak lengthy words came partly from dental discomfort. The dentures also affected his appearance. The Stuart portraits show the effects: the set of his jaw, the fullness of his face, the slightly pained expression that Stuart attributed to poorly fitting dentures. The teeth shaped how he looked, how he spoke, how he ate, how he appeared in public, how he felt in private. Were constant presence, constant source of pain and adjustment and management. But why do we remember this so vividly? Why does this detail persist when other aspects of his physical experience are forgotten? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how we relate to historical figures. We find the teeth humanizing, find the suffering accessible, find the physical indignity somehow satisfying. There is something in us that needs to bring Washington down from his pedestal. Needs to make the marble monument flesh, and the teeth serve this function, make him seem less perfect, less distant, more relatable through his suffering. But the attention to the teeth also feels like mockery, feels like reducing complex human to single physical failing, feels like the satisfaction we take in discovering that the great were also pathetic in some ways. The teeth matter because they were genuine source of suffering, because they affected his daily life significantly. Because they are part of the full picture of who he was, not just leader but person inhabiting flesh that failed him. But the teeth should not be primary thing we remember, should not overshadow his choices and actions and the consequences of those choices, should not become the defining detail, yet they have become precisely that for many people. The first thing they think of when they think of Washington, the detail that makes him memorable. This feels wrong, feels like we have lost proportion. Have made the physical detail more important than the historical significance, have reduced the person to the body and the body to its failings. The dental suffering also teaches something about embodiment and leadership, about carrying on despite physical pain, about maintaining public performance while privately suffering, about the gap between how leaders appear and how they feel. Washington presented himself as strong, capable, commanding, but he was in constant dental pain, constant discomfort. Constant management of physical reality that made simple acts like eating difficult. The maintenance of appearance despite physical suffering required constant effort, required daily management, required accepting pain as simply part of existing. This is not unique to Washington. Many leaders maintain appearances while suffering privately. Many people do, but Washington's dental suffering is documented, is preserved, is available to us as window into the cost of maintaining public performance despite private pain. His letters mention dental problems frequently, not dramatically, not self-pityingly, just factually, noting appointments with dentists, requesting new dentures, describing fitting problems. The matter-of-fact tone suggests he had accepted this as simply part of his life, was not shocked or devastated by each new dental crisis, was simply managing ongoing problem as well as he could. The stoicism is remarkable, is testimony to his capacity for endurance, for accepting what cannot be changed and managing what can be managed. The teeth were problem he could not solve, could only endure, could only treat symptomatically without ever addressing root cause, and he endured for decades, without drama, without complaint beyond factual noting of the situation. The endurance itself is worth noting, is part of his character, is testimony to his capacity for bearing what must be borne. But ultimately, the teeth should be context, not content, should be part of understanding him fully, but not the primary thing we remember. The teeth mattered to him, shaped his daily experience, were genuine source of suffering, but they do not define his significance, do not determine his legacy, are not the most important thing to know about him, yet they persist in collective memory with prominence that feels disproportionate. This tells us something about ourselves, about what we find interesting, about how we relate to historical figures, about our need to humanize through focusing on physical failings, about our discomfort with treating people as simply great and our need to find the ways they were also pathetic. The teeth serve this need, satisfy this urge, allow us to feel superior to the founder, to find him ridiculous in ways that comfort us. This is not entirely wrong, is part of how humans relate to history. But it can also obscure more than it reveals, can make us focus on wrong things, can distract from what actually matters. The teeth that history remembers, forever discussed, forever prominent, forever testimony to what we choose to preserve and what we choose to forget, forever revealing our priorities, our needs, our relationship to those who cannot defend themselves from our judgments. The teeth matter, but they matter less than what we have made them matter. The person was more than his teeth. The life was larger than the dental suffering. The legacy exceeds the physical failings, yet the teeth persist, in memory, in what we teach children, in what we remember when we remember Washington. The teeth, forever remembered when so much else is forgot, forever testimony to what we choose to preserve, forever asking, why this, why remember the teeth when we forget so much else? The question remains, the teeth remain. The person beneath them, increasingly obscured by the detail we insist on foregrounding, forever. After every crisis, after every service, George Washington wanted only one thing: to return to Mount Vernon, to his fields, to his agricultural experiments, to his morning rides surveying his estates, to dinner with Martha, to the private life of a Virginia planter, to being simply himself rather than symbol of nation's hopes. This pattern repeated throughout his adult life: service, then desperate desire for retirement; crisis requiring his return, then reluctant acceptance; achievement, then another attempt to go home. The pattern reveals something essential about him: that the public service was genuine sacrifice, was not what he wanted, was not fulfilling his ambitions, was instead surrendering his actual desires for what the nation demanded. The sacrifice was real, the longing to be left alone was genuine, the returns to service were reluctant, and this reluctance somehow made him more trusted, made him seem more virtuous, made the nation believe he served for right reasons rather than personal ambition. The first retirement came after the Revolutionary War. 8 years of command, 8 years of holding the army together through defeats and cold and starvation, 8 years of writing letters begging Congress for supplies that never came, 8 years of watching men suffer and die, 8 years of being the person everyone looked to for hope when hope seemed irrational. When the war finally ended, when victory was finally achieved, Washington wanted only to go home, wanted to resume the life he had left in 1775, wanted to be done with public service, wanted to farm. The army gathered at Newburgh, New York for final assemblies before disbanding. Some officers wanted Washington to become king, actually proposed it, actually suggested that monarchy might be better than weak confederation. Washington rejected this absolutely, angrily, was appalled by the suggestion, gave speech insisting on civilian control, on democracy however imperfect, on the revolution's principles being honored rather than betrayed. Then he resigned his commission. The resignation ceremony happened December 23, 1783 in Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress was meeting. Washington entered the Maryland State House, stood before Congress, and resigned his military command. The act was unprecedented, shocking to European observers who could not imagine military leader voluntarily surrendering power, was proof of his virtue, was testimony to his commitment to Republican principles, was also what he desperately wanted: to be released from responsibility, to go home, to stop being General Washington and simply be George Washington. He gave brief speech, struggled with emotion, handed his commission to the President of Congress and left, returned to Mount Vernon, arrived Christmas Eve. Was home finally after 8 years, was released. The relief must have been profound, must have felt like being able to breathe again after years of holding his breath. He was home, the war was over, the service was complete, he could finally live the life he wanted. The retirement lasted less than 4 years. The Confederation was failing, the states were squabbling, the national government had no real power, economic crisis loomed, political crisis was constant. The nation needed stronger federal government, needed constitution, needed Washington's presence to legitimize the Constitutional Convention. He did not want to go, wanted to be left alone, but the pressure was enormous. Everyone said the convention would fail without him, that his presence was essential, that he had saved the nation through war and now must save it through peace. He resisted, then accepted, traveled to Philadelphia, presided over the convention, lent his authority to the Constitution's creation, then hoped, probably knew it was false hope, but hoped anyway, that he could return to Mount Vernon, that his service was finally complete, that retirement could finally be permanent. But the Constitution required president, and everyone assumed Washington would be first president, had to be first president, could not imagine anyone else in the role. The Electoral College voted unanimously. Every elector voted for Washington. No other candidate in American history has achieved unanimous electoral vote. The unanimity was testimony to his unique position, his irreplaceable role, his essential presence. It was also burden, was impossible standard, was requirement that he serve again when all he wanted was to be left alone. He accepted, traveled to New York, then the capital, took oath of office April 30, 1789, became first president, began 8 more years of service. 8 more years of being symbol rather than self. 8 more years of postponing the life he wanted for the life the nation needed him to live. The presidency exhausted him, made him old before his time, made him desperate to leave. He wanted to serve single term, wanted to establish precedent of limited service, but advisors convinced him second term was necessary, that the government was too new, too fragile, that it needed his steadying presence longer. He reluctantly agreed. Served second term, but refused third, absolutely refused. Nothing could convince him. Published his farewell address explaining his decision. Stepped down, returned to Mount Vernon. Finally, after decades of service. After sacrificing his 50s and 60s, the years when most people expect rest to nation's needs, he was home, was 65 years old, was exhausted, was done, finally permanently released, finally able to be just himself. He had 2 years. 2 years at Mount Vernon, 2 years of the life he had always wanted, 2 years of managing his estates, of riding his fields, of experimental farming, of being simply planter, simply husband, simply George Washington without the titles or the burden or the performance. 2 years before the illness came, before death came, before the permanent ending. 2 years are not enough, are not fair payment for decades of service, are not adequate retirement after lifetime of sacrifice. But they were what he got, 2 years, then death, then the eternal retirement he had not chosen but which finally, absolutely, released him from service. The pattern of reluctant service and desperate desire for home reveals something essential, reveals that the service was genuine sacrifice, that he gave what he did not want to give, that he surrendered his actual desires for what others needed from him. That the repeated returns to service despite desperate wish to be left alone were testimony to his sense of duty, to his inability to refuse when the nation needed him, to his prioritization of collective need over individual desire. This made him trustworthy, made the nation believe he was not seeking power for its own sake, not serving to aggrandize himself, not using public service for personal gain, was instead genuinely sacrificing private desire for public need. The sacrifice was real, the longing for home was genuine, and the fact that he kept returning despite the longing proved his virtue in ways that seeking service would have undermined. The general who wanted only to go home, the president who counted days until release, the man who gave his life to nation while wanting only to tend his gardens, the sacrifice, the service, the repeated surrender of personal desire, all testimony to character, all proof of virtue. All making him trustworthy in ways that ambition never could. He wanted to go home, was never allowed to stay there, returned again and again to service he did not want, until finally death released him, until the permanent retirement came, until Mount Vernon held him forever. The general who wanted only to go home, finally released, finally at rest, forever. George Washington fathered no children. This simple biological fact carries strange weight when considering the man who became father of his country. The metaphorical fatherhood that defines his legacy exists in tension with the absence of literal fatherhood. He married Martha Dandridge Custis in 1759. She was a wealthy widow with 2 young children, John Park, Jackie Custis, and Martha Park, Patsy Custis. Washington became stepfather to these children, raised them, loved them, was by all accounts devoted to them, but they were not biologically his, and he and Martha never produced children together, never created biological legacy, never had heirs of their body. The absence shaped their lives in ways we can only partially reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. Why no children? The question is ultimately unanswerable with certainty. Martha had proven her fertility through her first marriage, had borne 4 children, though 2 died young. So the inability to conceive with Washington suggests the issue was likely with him rather than her. Was he infertile? Did childhood diseases damage his reproductive capacity? He suffered from smallpox, dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis. Various accounts list various ailments. Did these leave him unable to father children? Or was the issue something else: infrequent sexual relations, some physical problem that went undocumented, simple biological incompatibility? We cannot know. The 18th century did not discuss such matters publicly. Washington left no record of his thoughts on the subject. Martha burned most of their private correspondence. What remains is only the fact: no biological children. And the question, what did this mean to him? The absence likely caused grief. Men of Washington's class and era expected biological heirs, expected to pass property to children of their blood, expected continuity. Expected dynasty, in some sense not political dynasty but familial one, the ordinary continuation of family line through generations. Washington must have expected this too, must have assumed when he married Martha that children would come, that he would have sons and daughters, that Mount Vernon would pass to his biological children. Instead, he had stepchildren, had Martha's children to raise, and he did raise them, did love them, did treat them as his own in every way except biology. But biology mattered in his world, mattered in ways we perhaps understand less clearly now. The lack of biological children meant the end of his direct line, meant Mount Vernon would pass to others, meant no one would carry forward his genetic inheritance. This must have been loss, must have been grief carried privately, must have been absence that he felt even while loving the children he did have. But the absence also freed him. This is uncomfortable truth, but true nonetheless. Having no biological children meant having no direct heirs to favor, no dynasty to build, no temptation to establish hereditary succession, no possibility of nepotism in the most literal sense. The absence made him safer as leader, made him less likely to pursue policies that would benefit his children at nation's expense, made him less tempted by the monarchical model where power passes from father to son. The absence was loss but was also liberation. Was personal grief but political asset, made him more trustworthy as Republican leader because everyone knew he had no heirs to advantage, no children to position for future power, no biological stake in creating dynasty. He could serve the nation without conflict of interest that children might have created. The stepchildren complicated this slightly. Jackie Custis was spoiled, according to contemporary accounts. Was indulged by Martha, perhaps by Washington too, in ways that biological children might not have been. Washington tried to educate him, to prepare him for responsible adulthood, but Jackie was not interested in study or self-discipline. Died young in 1781 of camp fever contracted while serving with Washington's army. Patsy Custis suffered from epilepsy, died at 17 in 1773 in Washington's arms during a seizure. Both deaths were grief. Both losses were profound, but they were also relief from worry, from responsibility, from the concern that stepchildren created. After their deaths, Washington and Martha raised two of Jackie's children, Eleanor Nellie Custis and George Washington Washie Custis. Loved them as grandparents love grandchildren, but again not biological, not direct heirs, not Washington's genetic continuation. Did the absence matter politically? It might have. The fact that Washington had no children to promote made his disinterest in power more credible, made his voluntary surrender of command more believable, made his rejection of kingship more persuasive. If he had sons, the offer to become king might have been more tempting, might have been a way to establish dynasty, might have appealed to paternal desire to secure children's future. But he had no sons, had no reason to want hereditary monarchy, had no stake in perpetuating his own power beyond his life. This made him safer, made the republic safer, made the democratic experiment more likely to succeed because the first president had no biological incentive to subvert it. The metaphorical fatherhood grew in absence of literal fatherhood. He became father to his soldiers, they called him father sometimes, saw him as paternal figure, became father to the nation. The term father of his country emerged during his lifetime. The metaphorical role filled space that biological role left empty. Or perhaps the absence of biological fatherhood created space for metaphorical fatherhood to expand, created capacity to father nation because he was not busy fathering family, created availability to be father to many because he was not father to specific few. The substitution was not chosen, but perhaps was necessary. Perhaps the nation needed childless father. Needed leader whose paternal care could extend to all because it was not concentrated on his own. But did the substitution satisfy him? Did being father to nation compensate for not being father to children? Did the metaphorical fatherhood fill the void that biological childlessness created? We cannot know. He left no testimony, no letter expressing his feelings, no diary entry revealing his thoughts. What remains is only the absence, only the fact. Only the biographical reality that the father of his country fathered no children of his own. The absence is strange, is notable, is worth contemplation. But ultimately it is mystery, is private grief we cannot access, is loss we can acknowledge but not truly understand. The father who had no children, the childless patriarch, the man who became father to millions while being biological father to none, the paradox, the absence, the grief we can assume but not document. The substitution of metaphorical for literal. The paternal role expanded to national scale perhaps because it could not be fulfilled at personal scale. All speculation, all conjecture, all attempts to understand what cannot be fully known. The father who had no children remains what he was: patriarch without direct heirs, leader without dynasty, man whose family line ended with him but whose legacy expanded to include millions. The absence that freed him, the loss that shaped him. The childlessness that perhaps made his broader fatherhood possible, forever absent, forever present, forever the paradox at the heart of his story, forever. There is contradiction at the heart of George Washington's story that cannot be resolved, only acknowledged, cannot be explained away, only held in its full uncomfortable truth. The man who led revolution for liberty-owned humans. Over 300 souls lived enslaved at Mount Vernon at the peak of his ownership. 300 people whose names we mostly do not know, whose stories are fragments, whose labor built the prosperity where Washington found peace, whose bondage made his freedom possible, whose enslavement made his leisure possible, whose stolen lives made his life comfortable. This is not peripheral detail, is not footnote, is not something to mention briefly and move past, is central truth, is defining fact, is contradiction that must be dwelt in, sat with, understood as fully as limited evidence allows. We must begin not with Washington but with them, with the people whose humanity was denied, whose labor was stolen, whose families were separated, whose children were born into bondage because their mothers were enslaved, whose lives were not their own. Some we know by name. Ona Judge Martha Washington's personal enslaved maid who escaped to freedom in 1796, who was pursued by Washington, who never returned, who lived free in New Hampshire until her death in 1848, who gave interviews late in life describing her enslavement and escape. Hercules' skilled cook who prepared Washington's meals, who was brought to Philadelphia when Washington was president, who escaped in 1797 and was never recaptured, who chose freedom over the supposed comfort of being enslaved in President's household. Christopher Shields' body servant who attended Washington's final illness, who was present at his death, who was freed in Washington's will. Most we do not know by name, know only from ledgers where they appear as property, as assets, as numbers in accounting books, field workers who grew tobacco, wheat, corn, house servants who cooked, cleaned, served, skilled craftspeople, carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers whose work maintained the estate, women who bore children who became Washington's property by inheritance law, children raised in bondage on the estate, elderly enslaved people who could no longer work but remained dependent on Washington's generosity for basic survival. All of them were there. All of them were part of daily life at Mount Vernon. All of them were essential to making Washington's life possible, and all of them were denied freedom by the man who proclaimed that all men are created equal. The contradiction is not just historical irony, is fundamental moral failure, is proof that understanding liberty intellectually does not guarantee extending liberty practically, is evidence that humans are capable of simultaneous greatness and grave wrong. That the same person can lead revolution for freedom while denying freedom, can articulate principles while betraying those principles, can see clearly in some directions while remaining blind in others. Washington knew slavery was wrong. His writings show increasing discomfort over time. He stopped buying enslaved people. He stopped selling enslaved people because he did not want to separate families. He grew uncomfortable with the institution even while continuing to participate in it. His discomfort is documented, but his discomfort never became sufficient action, never became abolition during his lifetime, never became liberation for those he enslaved. His will freed those he owned directly, not Martha's dour slaves whom he held through her, but those who were legally his property. The will stipulated they would be freed upon Martha's death, stipulated that elderly and infirm among them would be supported, stipulated that children would be taught to read and learn trades. The provisions were more generous than most slave owners provided, but they were also inadequate, were conditional, were posthumous, cost him nothing because he would be dead, and they excluded more than half of Mount Vernon's enslaved people, the dour slaves who remained Martha's property, who could not be freed by Washington's will, who remained enslaved until Martha's death and then passed to her heirs. The partial freedom his will provided was something, but it was not enough, was not justice, was not redemption, was gesture made too late and too conditional to count as genuine atonement. Martha freed the enslaved people early, December 1800, 1 year after Washington's death. Freed them not because she was committed to abolition, but because she was afraid that enslaved people waiting for her death to achieve freedom might hasten her death, afraid of being murdered by people with every reason to want her dead. The fear was rational, the danger was real. And the fact that she freed them out of fear, rather than principle, tells us everything we need to know about the moral calculus of slavery. The enslaved people were freed, but freedom came from their enslavers' fear, rather than from recognition of their fundamental humanity. Freedom should not have required waiting for death or inspiring fear, should have been granted because it was right, because humans cannot be property, because the liberty Washington proclaimed in public should have been practiced in private. But it was not. The freedom came late, came incomplete, came for wrong reasons, but came. What about those whose names we do not know, whose stories are lost, whose lives were lived in bondage at Mount Vernon and then ended, some buried in unmarked graves on the estate, some sold away before Washington stopped selling, some escaped if they were brave enough and lucky enough, most simply endured until death released them. Their stories are mostly unrecoverable. Are lost to historical record that recorded property transactions but not human experiences, that documented Washington's life in detail while treating enslaved people as background, as context, as property rather than people. The erasure is ongoing, is part of slavery's violence, is denial of full humanity that continues even after death because the stories are not preserved, the names are not known, the lives are not honored. We stand at Mount Vernon now and see Washington's world. But whose labor built that world? Whose hands constructed those buildings? Whose sweat watered those fields? Whose stolen lives made that prosperity possible? The enslaved people, always them, and they are mostly invisible, mostly unnamed, mostly forgotten except as collective abstraction, the enslaved people at Mount Vernon, rather than as individual humans with names and stories and lives that mattered. The contradiction at Washington's heart is America's contradiction, is the founding paradox. Is liberty proclaimed while bondage is practiced? Is equality declared while hierarchy is maintained? Is freedom for some built on bondage of others? Washington embodies this contradiction, makes it visible, makes it undeniable, makes it impossible to look away from. He was not worse than his peers. Many founders owned enslaved people, many maintained slavery while proclaiming liberty. But Washington was first, was most visible, was most important, was the one whose example mattered most. And his example was contradictory, was revolutionary about political liberty while being conservative about racial slavery, was willing to overthrow British authority while maintaining white authority over black bodies, was capable of seeing clearly that taxation without representation was tyranny while being incapable of seeing that enslavement itself was tyranny. The blindness was not innocent, was chosen, was maintained. Was protected against criticism that came even in his era from Quakers, from abolitionists, from enslaved people themselves who knew perfectly well that they were humans deserving freedom. The contradiction remains, cannot be resolved, cannot be explained away, cannot be made comfortable, can only be held, can only be acknowledged, can only be allowed to complicate how we understand him. He was great in some ways, was grievously wrong in others. Both things are true, both things matter. The greatness does not excuse the wrong. The wrong does not erase the greatness. They coexist in same person making same choices serving same interests. Washington the liberator was also Washington the enslaver. Washington who created democracy also maintained slavery. Washington who established precedents of freedom also established precedents of bondage. All true, all part of his legacy, all requiring acknowledgement without resolution. The enslaved humans in the Father's house were there, were essential. Were denied freedom by the man who made freedom possible for others. The contradiction is unbearable, but must be borne, must be held, must be part of how we remember him, not to diminish his achievements but to complete the story, not to condemn him simply but to understand him fully, not to cancel him but to acknowledge that humans are capable of simultaneous greatness and grave wrong, that being right about one thing does not make you right about everything. That leading revolution for liberty does not exempt you from criticism for denying liberty. The enslaved humans in the Father's house remain part of his story, part of the nation's story, part of the unfinished work of making real the promises that were proclaimed but not practiced. The contradiction, the wrong, the ongoing cost, all remaining, all requiring acknowledgement, all part of understanding who Washington was and who we are and what work remains, forever. On September 19, 1796, George Washington published what would become one of American history's most enduring documents. Not a speech, he never delivered it orally, never stood before Congress or crowds to read these words aloud. Instead, he published the text in Philadelphia's Daily American Advertiser newspaper, published it as letter to the American people, published it as farewell, as final address from president to citizens, as parting wisdom from founder to nation. The farewell address, written with substantial help from Alexander Hamilton, building on earlier draft James Madison had helped with, but ultimately Washington's words, Washington's wisdom, Washington's warnings. The address was meant to explain his decision to step down, was meant to offer guidance for nation's future, was meant to be his final public communication. But the farewell never ended, has never ended, continues speaking 2 centuries later, continues being relevant. Continues offering warnings that every generation rediscovers and every generation ignores. The address warned against permanent foreign alliances, against entangling the young nation in European conflicts, against commitments that would drag America into wars that were not its own. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, Washington wrote. The warning was practical. Was based on his understanding that America was weak, was vulnerable, was not ready to be involved in European power struggles. The warning was also prophetic. The temptation to form permanent alliances would recur, would intensify, would eventually dominate American foreign policy. The warning was given, was mostly ignored. America formed permanent alliances, became entangled exactly as Washington warned against. NATO, SEATO, various bilateral defense treaties, all the permanent alliances Washington cautioned against. The warning was prescient, but prescience does not equal heeding. The advice was sound, but sound advice does not guarantee following. The address warned against political parties, against the spirit of party that Washington saw emerging even during his presidency, against the division into factions that would prioritize party loyalty over national interest, against the bitterness and recrimination that partisanship creates. However political parties may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. The warning could not have been more clear, could not have been more emphatic, could not have been more immediately ignored. Political parties formed before his presidency ended, solidified immediately after, became fundamental feature of American politics, became exactly the engines of division and ambition that Washington predicted. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans, then Democrats and Whigs, then Democrats and Republicans. The parties changed names, but the pattern persisted. The partisanship intensified, the division deepened. Everything Washington warned against came to pass. The warning was prescient. Was accurate, was completely ineffective. The address warned against sectionalism, against the danger of regional identities superseding national identity, against North versus South tensions that were already visible, against the possibility of disunion. The warning was necessary, was urgent, was ultimately insufficient. The sectionalism grew, the tensions intensified. The Civil War came 6 to 5 years after the farewell address, proving that Washington's warnings about disunion were not paranoid but prophetic. The nation split. Brother fought brother. The unity Washington helped create was shattered, was eventually restored but at terrible cost. The warning was given, was not heeded, was proven correct through catastrophic failure to follow the advice. Why do we still read the farewell address? Why does it remain taught in schools, quoted in speeches, referenced in political debates? Perhaps because it continues being relevant, continues speaking to dangers that persist, continues warning against temptations that recur. The specific circumstances change, but the fundamental warnings remain applicable. The danger of foreign entanglements persists in different forms. The damage of extreme partisanship continues and intensifies. The risk of disunion emerges in new ways. Washington's warnings remain relevant because human nature remains constant, because the temptations he warned against are permanent temptations, because the dangers he identified are structural dangers inherent in Republican government. The farewell address is not just historical document, is living text, is ongoing conversation between founder and inheritors, is wisdom offered across centuries, is advice that we continue needing even while we continue ignoring it. But the farewell also reveals Washington's limits, reveals what he could not see or chose not to address. The address says nothing about slavery, nothing about the contradiction at the heart of the Republic, nothing about the betrayal of revolutionary principles in maintaining bondage. The omission is glaring, is testimony to his blindness or his cowardice or his complicity, is proof that even his wisdom was partial, even his foresight was limited, even his warnings were incomplete. He warned against foreign alliances and political parties and sectionalism, but he did not warn against slavery, the institution that would prove more divisive than anything else, that would lead to the Civil War he feared, that would be the fundamental test of whether the nation could survive. His silence on slavery in the farewell address is damning, is evidence that even at the end, even in his final address to the nation, He could not bring himself to confront the central contradiction. Could not warn against the danger he himself participated in creating. The farewell is wise about many things, but its wisdom is incomplete, its warnings are partial. Its silence about slavery is moral failure that we cannot ignore even while appreciating the wisdom it does contain. The farewell has been invoked by every political faction, by isolationists citing his warnings against foreign alliances, by those warning against partisanship, by those fearing disunion. Everyone finds what they need in Washington's words. Everyone claims his authority for their positions. The farewell becomes Rorschach's test, becomes mirror reflecting contemporary concerns, becomes whatever readers need it to be. This is perhaps inevitable, is how historical texts survive by remaining flexible enough to be relevant to changing circumstances. But it also means the farewell has been used to support positions Washington would not have supported, has been claimed by causes he would have opposed, has been made to say things it does not actually say. The text remains, but its meaning is contested, is interpreted differently by each generation, is made to serve purposes its author did not intend. The Senate still reads the farewell address aloud every year on or near Washington's birthday. A senator is chosen to read the entire text. The tradition began in 1862 during Civil War, when the Union needed to remember what was being fought for, what unity meant, what Washington had warned against. The annual reading continues, is one of few regular Senate traditions that has persisted across decades. The reading takes about 30 minutes. The chamber usually has sparse attendance, but the reading happens anyway, continues happening, keeps Washington's words alive in the institution he helped create. The tradition is moving, is testimony to the address's enduring significance, is recognition that the warnings still matter even if we continue not heeding them. The farewell never ended because we keep reading it, keep invoking it, keep finding it relevant, keep needing the wisdom it offers even while continuing to ignore that wisdom. The address speaks still, will continue speaking as long as the Republic survives, as long as the dangers it warned against persist. As long as we need reminders about principles we know but do not follow, the farewell that never ended, the warnings that remain unheeded, the wisdom that stays relevant, the final address that was not final, forever speaking, forever ignored, forever remaining what Washington intended guidance for nation's future, even when that future refuses the guidance. The farewell, the warnings, the wisdom, forever offered, forever needed. Forever speaking into silence that pretends to listen while continuing in the paths Washington warned against. The farewell never ended, never will end, speaks still, forever. The American Revolution proclaimed that all men are created equal, then immediately began defining men in ways that excluded most humans. The Declaration of Independence announced self-evident truths about liberty and equality. Then the nation built on that declaration maintained slavery, denied women any political rights, treated indigenous nations as obstacles to be removed, restricted full citizenship to white male property owners. The revolution promised freedom, delivered it selectively, created nation based on principles it systematically betrayed. George Washington led this revolution, embodied its contradictions, was simultaneously its greatest hero and participant in its greatest betrayals. Understanding Washington requires understanding the revolution's incomplete, compromised, contradictory character, requires holding both the achievement and the failure, both the vision and the betrayal. The revolution was genuine. This must be said clearly because the contradictions tempt cynicism, tempt dismissing the whole enterprise as hypocrisy, but the revolution genuinely established something new, genuinely created democratic framework unprecedented in scale, genuinely made popular sovereignty the foundation of government, genuinely established that power derives from consent of governed rather than divine right of monarchs. These achievements were real, were significant, were revolutionary in ways that changed world history. The compromises do not erase the achievements. The betrayals do not nullify the principles, but neither do the achievements excuse the compromises. Neither do the principles justify the betrayals. Both exist, both matter, both require acknowledgement without canceling each other out. The contradiction was present from the beginning. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal while owning humans." The Continental Congress debated liberty while maintaining slavery. The Revolution fought against taxation without representation while denying representation to women, enslaved people, indigenous nations, white men without property. The gap between proclaimed principles and actual practice was not oversight, was not accident, was deliberate compromise, was decision to prioritize unity of white male property owners over actually extending the proclaimed equality to all humans. The decision created nation but betrayed the nation's stated principles, created democracy but incomplete democracy, created freedom but freedom for some built on bondage of others. Washington participated in all of this, led the revolution while maintaining slavery, proclaimed liberty while denying it, created democracy while excluding most humans from democratic participation. His participation was not passive, was active, was central. Was essential to both the achievement and the betrayal. He led the army that won independence. He presided over the convention that wrote the Constitution. He established precedents that shaped the government. He was indispensable to the revolution's success, and he enslaved people, and he maintained white supremacy, and he participated in dispossessing indigenous nations, and he accepted gender hierarchy that denied women political participation. All of this was Washington. All of this was the revolution. All of this was the founding. The achievement and the betrayal were not separate, were unified, were the same people making the same choices, creating both democracy and its limitations, both freedom and bondage, both equality proclaimed and inequality practiced. The revolution's promises were real, were powerful, were transformative even incomplete. The principle that all humans are created equal was radical even when not practiced. Became tool for those excluded to demand inclusion, became basis for abolitionist arguments, became foundation for women's suffrage movement, became justification for civil rights activism. The revolutionary principles were seeds that would eventually grow beyond the founders' limited vision, would eventually be used to challenge the very limitations the founders built into the system. Frederick Douglass understood this, used the revolution's language to critique slavery, used the Declaration's principles to expose the contradiction between proclaimed equality and practiced bondage. The civil rights movement understood this, used the founding documents to demand America live up to its stated principles. The revolution's promises became weapons against the revolution's compromises. The principles proclaimed but not practiced became tools for eventually approaching actual practice. But this does not excuse the founders, does not justify the compromises they made, does not make their betrayals acceptable because later generations used their principles better than they did. They knew slavery was wrong. Others in their time said so clearly. Quakers condemned slavery. Enslaved people themselves testified to their humanity and demanded freedom. The founders were not innocent, were not simply products of their time who could not imagine differently. Others imagined differently. Others acted differently. The founders chose compromise, chose to prioritize white unity over universal freedom, chose to create nation that would require civil war to partially redeem, chose to postpone justice for political expedience. The choices were conscious, were deliberate, were wrong even by standards available in their own time. Washington's role in this betrayal was central. He could have used his authority differently, could have insisted on immediate abolition as price of his support for Constitution, could have freed those he enslaved during his lifetime, could have established different precedent about slavery and the presidency, could have refused to compromise with evil even when compromise seemed necessary for union. Would the Constitution have failed without compromise on slavery? Probably. Would there have been no United States? Possibly. But would that have been worse than United States that protected slavery, that required civil war, that established white supremacy as constitutional principle? The counterfactual is unanswerable. The question is worth asking. Washington chose union over justice, chose political possibility over moral imperative. The choice created United States, but at what cost? To whom? For how long? The revolution that betrayed its promise is still betraying its promise. The work is unfinished. The equality proclaimed has never been fully achieved. The liberty promised has never been universally delivered. The democracy created has never included everyone. The betrayals continue in different forms. The limitations persist in new configurations. The compromises of the founding remain visible in structures that maintain inequality, in systems that preserve hierarchy, in practices that deny full equality. Washington's revolution created something real, something significant, something that changed history, but it also created something incomplete, something compromised, something that betrayed its own stated principles. Both legacies are Washington's, both truths are ours to inherit. Both require acknowledgement, Both demand continued work. The revolution that betrayed its promise continues. The promise remains unfulfilled. The betrayal remains unremedied. The work continues, forever unfinished, forever requiring that each generation choose whether to pursue the promise or perpetuate the betrayal. Washington's choice was compromise. What is ours? The question remains. The revolution continues. The promise waits. The betrayal persists. All held together in the ongoing story of nations still becoming, still failing, still trying, forever incomplete, forever asking whether we will fulfill the promises the founders proclaimed but did not practice. The revolution, the betrayal, the promise, all continuing, all ours, forever.